if I look at the whole managed IT space, if you look at India, there are, I would call it as a couple of phases. Phase one was when people said, let me do an AMC, etc., and went after that. Phase two was when IBM brought in some sophistication in terms of doing outsourcing into the country. They did a couple of large bids. They did a Parthi, which was significant. They did a fair amount of other companies. And if you remember at that point of time, the story which IBM went about was, how do I help a company restructure their asset base, about the financial engineering as a driver for outsourcing. And later on, it became expertise, which they started leveraging. The next phase has been about the growth of companies like Wipro and others, and we started saying outsourcing, but slowly we said, how much do we do a managed IT services? I think the current phase is going to be a lot more about managed IT services more than outsourcing, because the customers here are slowly warming up to saying manage things remotely for me, which most international customers have been used to doing. That's an offshoring story. But whereas in India, that's what. Second place where we are finding a significant chunk of interest coming in is cloud. How do customers move to cloud? So that starts becoming a remote management or managing IT in a different way. There's a lot of talk, and I think what we're also finding slowly is the adoption is increasing in the enterprise space from a cloud perspective, which is going to significantly move forward. Second, what we're finding, things like application monitoring. Okay. Today, it's very nascent in the space, but if you can manage or look at and understand and apply an application monitoring and management, you can actually cut down a lot of footprint and cost for the customers. For example, if I'm using 2 servers, can I redo the application slightly to make it just 1 server? That's an extreme example. So I save money on one server. Third, of course, there's a big momentum, and I think it's pretty stable now from a virtualization and those kind of data center build, etc. Fourth, we're talking about asset management or the life cycle of an asset management. So this is the core infrastructure services which are going where companies are saying, let me get a little more sophisticated, let me start trusting a little more and outsourcing it to the service providers rather than keep it in-house, and how do I reduce cost? Momentum is in retail. The retail companies are slowly coming up. We're finding an expansion of people like Walmart, etc., who are bringing in those managed practices. So it's growing significantly at a retail level. And once the retail liberalization or whenever that happens, you're going to find a bigger thrust in terms of the retail. There's a big revival in manufacturing where, again, from an efficiency perspective, they're going to increasingly move towards a managed services space. So I think the role of an CIO is going to enhance significantly. If you look at the old environment, a CIO was saying, I need to do some things new, but at the same time, I need to run the infrastructure. Many times they got bogged down running the infrastructure. They spent far less time creating new applications or new sources of growth or new sources of leverage for the companies that they worked in. So the challenge always was, hey, I'm the CIO, but I'm getting bogged down in my day-to-day operations, or how do I run it? With managed IT services, or how they start moving, how they run the IT infrastructure away from the company, whether through, just giving it as a managed services contract or moving it to a cloud or moving it to this thing, they're going to reduce the amount of time they spend on the operational aspect of this thing, or the coordination aspect of what you would call it, and they'll start increasingly spending more time on enabling new applications, new areas, new these things, so they get more strategic from the time they get back from going increasingly for a managed services contract. Big data has two things. One is, do you have data source? Do you have the talent? You have a shortage today of both. How do I get an organized data source or a semi-organized data source or an unstructured data source in a nice way? And do I have the people to leverage, or do we have the enough data scientists and other kind of things to do? Certain sectors did it always. And if you look at banking, people like HDFC Bank, etc., built large data warehouses, started leveraging it towards this thing some years back. So they learned and they started getting more and more sophisticated about how we manage data. But I think the beauty about it is for us, you look at our own case, today we manage about tens of thousands of ATMs where cash is drawn. The amount of data which we have at different points, if we take that and leverage, you can actually say where is the consumer spending and correlate it with that in a big way. So those are new applications which you didn't think about, which you didn't this thing, but big data is going to enable newer things to do things very differently or enhance business very significantly. Historically, if you look at, or even today in the US kind of an environment, big data means 90% of it is going into a web-centric world, saying a Facebook, a Twitter. Those are the guys who are really using big data, or you go to those companies or Google, they're the guys who are innovating on technologies like your Hadoop and those kind of things came out of these companies. So they've created those ecosystem of people who are analyzing. But I think in India it's going to be driven more by enterprise than social media, because social media is not this thing, or enterprise enabled internet business. If you look at guys like Flipkart, etc., they are ideal candidates to leverage big data in a much more effective way. So that's the difference you're going to find is more than social, it's going to be enterprise. 2, we need to create more skills. 3, I think as there are more success stories which come out, like in our own CMS example, if we can leverage where we put money and know how money is moving across so many ATMs across the country and use that as a consumer spending pattern, those are the kind of things it's going to energize or light up the big data in a big way. I have a son who's going into college in the United States and to a different environment. And what I see as a big difference between there and here is there's a lot more culture of people doing hands-on work right at the college level. It's very practical oriented. My son studies in Carnegie Mellon. It's a good institute, but what they force you to do is people go pick up coding on their own. They don't attend classes or they don't attend a training program, but it's because there's a whole American culture of saying, let me do it on my own. 2, there's a huge emphasis on internships. So most students look for internships at the end of their first year, at the end of their second year, at the end of their third year. So by the time they complete the 4 years of college, they've gone through 3 jobs of 3 months each. So it's almost like a 1-year work experience, which they're coming out in a 4-year graduation program, because their summer vacations are 3 months long to enable people to earn a little money to pay their fees, etc., etc. So it becomes, 1 is a hands-on, 2, there's a huge premium on doing the internships or learning how to do the nuts and bolts. So when those kids come out at the end of 4 years, they're a lot more ready because they've actually rolled up their sleeves and worked. Whereas here, if you look at an engineering graduate, okay, in passing, somebody may have done an internship or a project in a company just because it's a course requirement, but it's not a serious thing. So I think what industry can do big time here is, can you adopt people for internship? Open up these things, take those kids in, pay them some money, it doesn't matter what the money is, but most important is, can you give them a 2-3 months work in a year to come and work in your place in a big way? And that is going to enable people getting a practical sense or getting a little more industry ready when they go into this thing. I think that's something which the industry can contribute, which we don't. Because if you look at, even the biggest of the companies, the number of interns they take is very small. Whereas you go there, even a small company, a startup company, would take 5, 10, 15 interns, because they actually use them not just to say, I'm teaching you, but they're saying, hey, you also contribute to the work. So they're making them that much more job ready. So I think those are the differences with hands-on culture. That takes longer term. Internship, I definitely think we have enough companies today who can offer internships in a much bigger way, and that will transform the job readiness aspect of it, in the next 3-4 years itself, if you can do that. Today, I see there are 3 kinds of companies which combine, in my own view. One, I call them as a multinational. Okay. Kind of a company. So, for example, you take a company like Info Systems. If you look at how they deploy IT, they deploy it no different from any other Fortune 500 company. In my own experience, roughly 20% of the companies with about 40% of the IT infrastructure are in that category of multinational. Either they're multinationals or Indian companies working globally, but essentially they work like a Fortune 500 company from an IT infrastructure perspective. Okay. There you would find business enablement is a significant aspect of how they drive IT more than cost. So you find the CIOs are more powerful, CIOs have a seat at the table. Many of them, the CIOs report directly to the CEO, not through the CEO, etc. The second kind of companies are the Indian companies which are extremely innovative. Okay, I give the example of telco. When they did this whole nano, how they went about or how they redid the engineering. So these are a lot of Indian companies who constitute, or they want to get more out of IT than anybody else would think of. So they drive innovation to a level where I can get a much higher return or use the IT dollars much more effectively. Number of examples. If you look at a stock exchange, how they computerized, today the transaction cost is much lower than a New York Stock Exchange, or whether you look at a telco or whether you look at companies which are extremely they're typically ones which have a domestic demand. They're driving a lot of innovation. Again, IT is a big enabler. They're using that a lot more for a business. I think they're about 40% of the companies with 40% of the infrastructure. So 20% is the multinationals with 40%. 40% is these 2 categories. Then there are other 40% of the companies who are very cost driven, where you will still find the CIO would be reporting to a CFO. They'll go and buy the lowest cost. They'll go and buy this thing, whether it's effective or not, this is the way I buy. Some of your public sectors may come in that, but many of the private sector companies also behave in that fashion. So I would look at those 3 kind of categories that have evolved, where somebody wants to be global, somebody wants to be very innovative, and somebody who's still very traditional about cost and how they leverage IT. So that's what I would look at, how the industry has evolved. The healthy aspect is you find the first 2 parts are growing significantly, which was a very small part 20 years back. Hopefully, the trend will continue that, more and more companies increasingly come into one of those 2 categories from an IT perspective. CMS is, broadly speaking, what we talk about is we're having offerings around the managed infrastructure. Mainly, we're an infrastructure services company. We're getting into some elements of the application monitoring space. We're not going to be an application development company or an application implement. We're not going to implement SAP. We're not going to sing, but we're going to run SAP. To give an example. So we're going to be mainly in the infrastructure side. Our hope is that managing the infrastructure in an increasingly secure and increasingly cost-effective way is the growth driver. Things like, how do you manage the data center? How do you manage the security? How do we run the application a little better through a performance monitoring? How do we run cloud for a customer? Because we're not going to be a cloud provider, we are going to be a cloud enabler. We will take the public platforms like a Microsoft or or help companies set up their own cloud infrastructure. Okay, but we're going to say, hey, I can take you from the physical on-premise world to a mixed world of on-premise and off-premise to make your cloud in a much more effective way. So these are some of the drivers we see as things like cloud, things like your mobility, things like managing a secure infrastructure, things like managing mobile things are where we're going to increasingly make our money and profits as we go by. These are the areas which we look at as the growth drivers for the company.